Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel Land. If you're new to the channel, well, you picked a sad day to pop along because it's the A to ZX of the spectrum, but it's going to be the last one of the alphabet, because you see the last part of the alphabet, that's VWXYZ. Well, there's not enough quality games, or at least not enough quality games I've got access to put in 5 games for each of those letters, so this will be the last one when it comes to the alphabet. Now, it's not going to be the last one of the series because, well, a certain someone, a certain Mr. 005 Agima, well, he decided early on that I was missing something. Now, I wasn't missing this thing, I was not missing numbers at all. It was just I wanted to do A to Z first and then move on to the numbers, but he eagle-eyed spotted it, and there will be next week numbers, so that's something to look forward to, right? But if you want to see what's going to come up for the letters VWXYZ, well, you just wait until after these titles. First up for the last of the alphabet is the letter V, and we're going to be looking at Vigilante, which was ported to the ZX Spectrum in 1989 by IREM Software and distributed by US Gold. And straight off the bat I'm going to apologise, because you know what, I did know that when we got to the end of the alphabet I was going to have limited choices, but I was hoping I could get at least 5 decent games for the last 5 games of this particular series. Vigilante, however, is not one of those good games. As I said at the beginning, it's an arcade port, so of course the alarm bells were ringing. We've all seen the little microcomputer that tried just too hard time and time again in this series. And this game, Vigilante, well, it was no exception. But to be fair to the ZX Spectrum, this was 1989, and of course the 8-bit era was coming to the end of its life cycle, and the 16-bit microcomputers and consoles were starting to take hold of the market. Now, that's no excuse for developers just to throw out a bad game, but that's what they do. And unfortunately, this game was touted as a spiritual successor to Kung Fu Master from 1984, a game that is actually quite fun to play. But of course, trying to ram this late 80s arcade game into a ZX Spectrum, well, it was never going to work. Now, we know for a fact that the developers knew that they were biting off far more than they could chew, because if you take a look at the option screen before you start the game, you'll notice you have the option of colour or mono. Now, the Spectrum was a colour computer, it's in the title of the computer itself, the ZX Spectrum, but it just couldn't handle colours well on different layers. And because this was a modern arcade game, well, modern at the time anyway, colour was a big deal, so to give you the option, they put the colour version in there, but the clash was horrible. But obviously, knowing this, they also put in a mono colour option, which, don't get me wrong, didn't play any better, but at least the colour clash was gone and you could at least try and play the game. So will I be recommending Vigilante for the ZX Spectrum? Then absolutely no, just stay away from it. I'll be frankly honest with you, the other 8-bit ports as well, such as the Master System or Commodore 64, well, to be frankly honest, they weren't much better either. So no, absolutely not, do not go near this game, do not go near it with a 10-foot pole, as some people might say. And that is Vigilante from IREM Software, distributed by US Gold in 1989. For the letter W, we're going to have a look at Hi-Tech Software's Wacky Races from 1992. And I know there's a few Spectrum fans who watch this particular series and they're going to wonder why I haven't put in the Way of the Exploding Fists. Now, there is a reason for that, a good reason, but I won't go into it, and I'm digressing too much from the actual game here, because what we're here to look at just now is Wacky Races. And yes, it is of course based on the cartoon series from the 1960s and of course onwards from Hanna-Barbera. But what is the game itself? Well, this is quite an interesting one, and one of the reasons I chose it is because this is an arcade racing platform game, and I would quite truly love to know if anyone out there knows of any other game that is an arcade racing platform game, because for the entirety of my 40 plus years of playing games, I have never came across a game that has mixed these two genres before. So yes, if you know one, let me know in the comments. Now, in many ways it does just play like a platform game. You're moving from left to right across the screen, using platforms to progress, much like Sonic the Hedgehog, but instead of just trying to get to the end of the level, well, you're in a race. So not only do you have to finish the level like you would in the other platform games of this era, you would have to beat the other cars that are also racing you on this platform track. And to make the game just that tad bit more special, you're not just driving any old car, no, you're in Dick Dastardly's Mean Machine. Now yes, of course, he was the bad guy in the cartoon, but you know what? Sometimes it's nice to play the bad guy. Graphically, the game is fantastic for a ZX Spectrum game. Now it is 1992, so we are talking the very end of the Spectrum era. Even 16-bit consoles have taken hold of the world by this point, so looking at it with modern eyes, it might just not look that special compared to what you would expect from a 1992 game. But from a Spectrum point of view, it definitely deserves that good old-fashioned chef's kiss. The gameplay is smooth, it's well animated, and yes, they stuck to a monochromatic theme just to avoid that awful colour clash which would have totally destroyed this game. So as you can probably tell, this game is getting a big thumbs up from me, so yes, definitely get yourself out there, try to get a copy of this game, emulate it if you must, but definitely play it, because without a doubt this was one of the great games to end the ZX Spectrum era on. So make sure you add it to your list of games to play, and that is Wacky Races from High Tech Software in 1992. For the letter X, we're going to have a look at Namco's Xavius from 1986. That's correct, 1986 is when it was ported to the ZX Spectrum. The arcade game, of course, came out in 1982. Now Xavius does get a lot of stick, and to be frankly honest, that's more down to when they released this game rather than the game itself. Because taking this long to release the game, well, when it did eventually come to the home micros and other 8-bit consoles, it was essentially put up against newer and more polished vertical shooters such as 1942. Had Xavius came out for the ZX Spectrum in 1982 as a, well, let's face it, a launch title, this would have blown people away. The graphics, which are basic by today's standards, would have been standout in 1982. And how smoothly this game manages to scroll on the ZX Spectrum would have been a sight to behold in 1982. And despite having the ZX Spectrum's classic monochromatic colour scheme, the colour in this game does shift as you move from level to level, which would have been a lovely touch back in 1982. And with Xavius you had quite interesting combat for 1982. You were of course shooting down the aerial ships that were approaching and trying to take you out, but you also had crosshairs for a bomb which indicated where you could bomb ground targets, which in 1982 was phenomenal gameplay mechanics, but by 1986 this kind of thing was old hat. And if you haven't already noticed, well, I'm going to point out that I've said in 1982 quite a lot, and that's just to draw attention to the fact that this game would have been outstanding in 1982, but it was developed for and released in 1986, and this is the problem we have with Xavius. It was a great game from the past, it wasn't updated for a modern day port. Now I say modern day, there was only 4 years of a difference, but that 4 years in video game time, well, we all know that can make a generational leap. And I think it's because this game didn't display that generational leap that it got so much hate. But does that make it a bad game? Well no, it just makes it a game of its time, and for that very reason I would suggest that you do at least try this particular port of Xavius. Now of course Xavius was ported to many other systems, as most of you will all know, but this series is about the ZX Spectrum and what I recommend you playing on it these days. So definitely get yourself out there, find a copy of this game, or as I say, always emulate it if you can, and give this game a second chance. And bear in mind that this game was originally released in 1982, and that's Xavius from Namco, the ZX Spectrum port released in 1986. For the letter Y, we're going to have a look at Yeah Kung Fu, a Konami game released by Imagine for the ZX Spectrum in 1985. And if you have no experience at all of Yeah Kung Fu, well, you can probably tell what type of game it is just looking at the gameplay. And not only can you tell what type of game it is, you can tell what type of game this game is the granddaddy of. And that quite simply is your one-on-one beat-em-ups, your fighters, your Street Fighter, your Mortal Kombat, your Tekken. If it was a fighting game, this is where it started. Now of course that didn't automatically mean everyone loved this game. I for one didn't quite get on with this game at all. And not because the gameplay was bad, not because the game in general was bad, it was just simply down to the controls. Now if you had a joystick and you were used to playing on a microcomputer with a joystick, then this probably was okay. I however, well, I was more of a keyboard fan when it came to controls, and to control this game on a keyboard you required 9 separate keys. That's correct, I had to use every single finger except one. Well okay, not quite like that, but yes, I had to move about the keyboard quite a lot just to pull off even a fraction of the moves you needed to win this game. Now I mentioned earlier that I didn't use Way of the Exploding Fists for the letter W, and that's because I was using this game. Both Yi Kung Fu and Way of the Exploding Fists are very similar games. Way of the Exploding Fists was more karate based, whereas this was much more kung fu or action kung fu, but both of them used the exact same control scheme. The difference being, the Way of the Exploding Fist was much slower paced. It was much more about the tactics of the move. You moved slowly towards your opponent and thought about what attacking move or defensive move you were going to have to use to score the point against your opponent. Whereas Yi Kung Fu, well, it was much faster paced and much more arcadey. But at the end of the day, there's just absolutely no denying it. Without Yi Kung Fu, would we have Mortal Kombat, Pit Fighter, Street Fighter, Tekken, you name it, would we have them? Well, who knows, because we can't just go back in time and take a game out of history, and I'm quite glad we can't do that. But the $1 million question, do I recommend someone playing Yi Kung Fu today in 2021? Well, absolutely, because there's not many games out there where you can so directly trace a whole genre almost completely back to that one game, and this game is certainly up there as a prime candidate for that. So get your hands on a copy of this game any way you can and definitely get it played. And that is Yi Kung Fu from Konami in 1985. For the letter Z, we're going to be looking at Zoom from Imagine in 1983. So that's right, we're finishing on quite an early game for the ZX Spectrum. And what we have here with Zoom is an early flight combat simulator. And I mean very early, because in 1983, developers or programmers, coders, they were just cutting their teeth on this new technology. Now as you can see from the gameplay, it's very basic. You have a crosshair which you can move up, down, left and right, and you use that quite simply to fly your plane, which is always in motion, find the enemy targets and destroy them before they bomb the refugees who are running about on the ground. Now there were of course a few interesting gameplay mechanics happening with Zoom, especially for a game in 1983. If you look down at the bottom right hand side, you have a larger map, which was there so you could see where the enemies were or where they were going to be coming from. And to the left of that you have various readouts. Your life counter was in the far left. Beside that you had your shields, or how much power you had left in your shields, which was a nice touch back in 1983, because normally games back then, one hit, one death. Not with this. And to the right of that, well, you had an altimeter, so you knew exactly how close you were to crashing into the ground. Now as I said, the point of the game is just simply to blow up as many of the enemy planes that are coming your way before they bomb the refugees, and it was a simple high score game. The thing about Zoom is, however, once you got maybe just a little bit bored playing it, you ended up just starting to shoot the refugees yourself. Well, once you got over the challenge of actually playing the game and accumulating a high score for yourself, that is. But it certainly was one of the earliest games where you could maybe be just a little bit naughty, and let's face it, we're all tempted to do that in games every now and again. But do I recommend anyone playing this game in 2021? And the answer to that is, well, yes. In essence, it's an early first person shooter, disguised as a flight combat sim. And because it's a good old fashioned high score game, well, you can have tons of fun if you've got the right friends round playing this with you. So definitely get out there, get yourself a copy of this game and get it played. And that's Zoom from Imagine Software in 1983. So there you have it, my friends, another selection of 5 8-bit masterpieces from the ZX Spectrum collection. And yes, I say it every week because they are 8-bit masterpieces, well they are to me. Now if you want to talk about any of these games, then just drop that down in the comments, whether you've played them and you want to talk about them, whether you haven't played them, would like to play them and want to talk about it, or whether you'd like to see them fired into the sun and forgotten for all eternity. Well, you can drop that down into the comments too, whatever you want to chat about, because the interaction between you and me, well, that makes all the difference in this channel. If you want to see more, well, the subscription button, always there, always free, and you can always change your mind. So thank you very much for watching, and until next time, cheerio!